Hi guys, welcome to part 9 of this Serum overview. And in this section of the tutorial course, we are going to be discussing the effects tab inside of the synth. So right when you click on it, you will see a grayed out part of the screen, as well as 10 different little tabs that denote the 10 different effects that you can use in Serum. It's technically 12, and we'll talk about why that is through the course of this video. First, you'll see that when you turn one on, it illuminates, and then you have the tabs, and the rack actually mounts itself in the rack mount space. And you have all 10 of these. You have distortion, you have flanger, phaser, chorus, delay, compressor, reverb, EQ, filter, and then the first one, which I forgot to mention, was the hyper/dimension. So when you activate these, they will all appear as rack mount modules over on the right, and you'll need to scroll with this scroll bar on the right-hand side to actually see all of them if you have multiple ones loaded. And you can turn these on and off with these power switches as well. So that way they still say and remain open. Because when you close this and turn this off over here, it removes the rack mount. So that way, if you're kind of on the fence about a certain effect or you might like it, you can turn it on or off that way and then save CPU power doing so. So let's go through the idea of rearranging these modules, because that's one of the coolest features inside of Serum's effects unit. So much like a DAW, the Serum effects are designed to whatever one is first, or in order of where they actually lie in this rack here, is what's going to hit the sound signal or the output first. So right now, by default, it would be hyper, dimension, and then distortion. But in a real world example, you might want to add some EQ to carve out some low frequencies, to your sound, and then do your effects. So it works the same way a DAW does, where you need to be conscious of the signal flow that you want to have to your sound to get the best results. So let's talk about this hyper/dimension. This is the only effect module in Serum that has two distinct tabs. The first one, which is on by default, you'll see here the mix is at dry or 0 for the dimension, is this hyper. Now this is a cool effect because this is a pseudo unison effect. So if I turn this off using this power button I just mentioned and play a note, we have a single saw sound. If I turn this on, let's turn the mix up, turn the detune up. It sounds like we're using different, like we're actually using different voices of unison and detune in the oscillator, but we're not. So two reasons you can do this is, I would say it actually, if you guys are on an older machine or an older computer, this saves processing power because this is a pseudo unison. It's not actually creating voices of unison. It's kind of just emulating that sound. So if you are using an instance of Serum that seems to be hitting your CPU really hard and it's unisoned a lot, you have a lot of unison detuned voices, maybe try lowering the unison voices in the actual oscillators and then using this hyper effect. So the knobs that you get are the rate, which is the rate at which you hear this kind of swarming effect. Then you have the detune, which is the amount of voices that it's simulating. And then the voices, which goes from 0 to 7. And mix, which is a level of the dry wet. So at 0, you won't hear anything. Now to talk about this retrig, I'm going to have to backtrack a little. So let's turn this off for a second and go back to our oscillator. And let me add some voices of unison. Now if I turn the phase and random down and start playing notes, I'll turn the blend up as well. It's kind of like that laser zap sound. So if you turn up the random and the phase, you don't have that effect. And the higher you get with it, the less of the effect you have. Right? Well, now let me turn the unison voice back down to 1. Go back to the effects module, turn it on. This retrig will simulate that same type of sound. All right, let's move on. Let me turn the mix down for the hyper. Let's go on to the dimension. Now the dimension expander, I believe by definition is a coursing effect, but it doesn't really sound like a coursing effect. It just actually sounds like a delay/reverb. And so it's a spatial width/processing. And if you guys use Massive, you'll know what this is. It's kind of like the dimension expanders. All right, and so it's something that's an interesting feature because if you actually sum your mixes in mono or someone's listening in mono, this effect goes away. So it's definitely something to pepper in there. All right, let's go on to the distortion module. There are 13 different types of distortions at your disposal inside the distortion rack mount module itself. And you'll see that you actually have a EQ, which we'll cover, and then this kind of very basic display of when you turn the drive, it'll kind of show you what's going on with that certain distortion type. So that's very useful as a visual tool. So tube, I'm going to run through what these do quickly. I'm not going to cover in depth what this distortion is or what distortion types are because that's outside the scope of this tutorial. But tube, that's great for like sounds like, let's say you want to bass a sound like a tube-driven bass in the real world, like an electric bass. That might work, or guitar. Soft clip is going to apply a clipping. It's going to simulate a clipping overdrive distortion just very softly, as the name suggests. Hard clip will be a little bit more aggressive. And to show you what these distortion types are going to sound like, let me actually go and we will load up let me find a sine wave. All right, here's a sine wave. So it sounds like this without the distortion. All right, let's turn the mix up and the drive up on the soft clip. So you can see it's not crunching it too much. Hard clip, you start to get a little bit more crunchy. Right? And then diodes are going to be even more crunchy and digital and bright. Okay, diode 2. All right, moving on to linear fold. Now this is going to take certain parts of the frequencies and kind of fold them back on themselves. So we can get very, very bright and harsh and digital. Sine, this is going to be a similar thing where it's folding, but it's going to be sinusoidal. I love that word. All right, let's go on to zero square. This is going to make it sound like a square. Or have some square-ish elements to it. Downsample. Now this is going to degrade the audio quality, so it's going to introduce some aliasing. Speaking of aliasing, the distortion inside of Serum, for all you guys who actually care about this and care about Nyquist frequencies and all that, that's where sometimes when you add distortion, you get frequencies that are below the actual frequency that you're playing or that you want represented in your sound. They're kind of these phantom frequencies. And so sometimes it helps to do what is called oversampling to get rid of those. I believe the oversampling amount inside of Serum is 4 times. So that's pretty darn good. So you won't, if you use these, I don't think you'll really need to actually oversample when you sum your mix and things like that. So if that didn't make any sense to you, don't worry about it. It's beyond what you're doing in your mix, and it's something that you actually don't technically have to do. All right, then you have asym. It's going to be an asymmetrical blend of the distortion folding. Pretty powerful one. You have rectify. Just gets very buzzy and bright. All right, and now let's go to the X shaper, which I think is one of the coolest ones. So much like we talked about with the remap on the warp mode back in a previous video, it's the same type of idea. So right now with this drive, you move it, it'll do nothing. You have this, you'll see that this edit A and edit B popped up. If you click it, let's just load a shape. I'm going to load a square, and we'll X out of this. And so you'll see now there's a square wave appearing. And let's go to edit B, and now I'm going to pick like a crazy sidechain. Let's do miscellaneous and do a bit crazy. And now you'll see when I do my drive to the right, you'll see the crazy waveform. So it's a way to create your own shapes that are kind of folding on itself. So kind of like the sinusoidal sine shaper. You're doing that, but you can create your own shapes, which is really cool. And you have 2 of those options. So let's talk about this, the EQ here. You have a setting for off, obviously. Then you have pre and post. So one will happen before the distortion, and post will happen after. And you have a general curve control on this little dot. And you can toggle between low pass, a blend between low pass, band pass, and then band pass, and then band pass and high pass. So it's a really powerful tool for your distortion, because what you can do is you can carve out some of those frequencies that you don't want. Like a lot of producers now will take out some of the highs and leave in, you know, some of the lows to keep it crispy, or to keep the higher end open, or some of them will even do vice versa to get that big distorted sound. So there's a bunch of ways to do that. So let me go back to my initial preset for us to talk about the flanger. Now the flanger inside of Serum, with some of these effects, I'm not going to touch on what a flanger does. I will definitely point out any of the features of any of these effects units that are really actually unique to Serum. So I'll run through them a little bit as well. So this flanger, you have a rate knob, which is with the BPM unchecked, it will be in hertz from 0 to 20, and BPM, it'll give you note values. And the depth is going to be the depth of the peak and valleys of that frequency modulation. And then your feed is going to be the feedback loop of the going into that circuit of the flanger. And then phase is going to be an offset of it. And of course, you have the mix. So this is a general flanger. The phaser, same thing. There's nothing really unique about this. It is just a general phaser. You have your rate, your BPM, your depth frequency, which is the frequency that's going to be phasing, and your feedback, phase, offset, and mix as well. The chorus, I'll talk about that in a pinch more depth here. The chorus is a 4-voice chorusing effect where there are 2 left and 2 right. So you have these 2 different delays to kind of control that. You have a BPM sync for the rate as well. You have the depth, the feed. You even have a low pass filter because sometimes with chorus it adds some unwanted frequencies in the low end, so you can kind of control those. And of course you have your mix. So let's talk about this delay because this delay has some pretty cool features to it. So you'll notice right off the bat you have a feedback. So let's look at what that's going to sound like. So with feedback at 0, there's not much feedback, this is going to be how long your delay signal actually keeps pinging or you keep hearing it after you let up on key. So if I just play a key and let up, guy's going to bounce forever when I have the feedback all the way up. So you have a BPM and you have a link. So if you don't want it on a BPM, you just want it as like a, maybe more of a sound effect type delay, you can uncheck BPM. But when you do check BPM, you'll notice that your left and right times are denoted in musical values. And if you want to move them at the same time, like let's say you were like, okay, I just really want this to be 2 bars. Now, I have to go move this 2 bars. Well, what you can do is you can select link, and then they will move at the same value, which is really helpful. So I'm going to do 1/2. Let's do a half note for left and a quarter for right. Now down here, you can do your delay offset on the left and delay offset on the right. And you'll notice that if you go down to the very bottom, it's a dotted half, and then you can even hit a triplet half. But then the rest of it's just, in between a decimal place in between 1, and I believe it goes just about a pinch above 2. And then you hit the triplet. So there's some cool features that you can do. So I'm going to do dotted half for both these, and we'll see how this sounds. All right, now let's move over to this, the EQ. You can carve out certain frequencies. You can basically make this look like a band pass, a high pass, or a low pass, depending on how you move this little circle and this toggle. And then you can see the zoom and where you're at in the frequency range. So there's 3 different modes of delay inside of Serum's delay. They are normal. They're ping pong, which this will bounce back and forth between the left and right speakers. All right, and then tap. This is a cool one. So if I hit my note once, you'll hear 1 note of delay. So let me turn my feedback down to show you that. All right, so the feedback at 0, if I hit my note, if I hit just the note once, you'll hear 1 note of delay. If I hit it twice, 2, and then 3 times. So let's turn this up to about 50% and hit it once and see what happens. So you can see that it's incrementally increasing with your percent amount. And that depends on the left and right signal. So you can get some really cool results with that. And then, of course, you have the mix knob. So let's go down to the compressor because there are some things I want to talk about in the compressor that are very, very, very unique to Serum. Okay, so you get your general controls of a compressor threshold. It works like this. So if you turn it down, there's really no good way to show a threshold amount on just one rotary knob. So I think they did the best job they could with this. If you turn it down right now to 0, you're not going to hear the compressor because the threshold is going to be 0 dB. So that's going to be extremely loud. Like that, your sound source would have to be literally clipping, almost reaching unity or clipping to get there. So if you turn it up, this will slam your sound a lot. And it can go all the way to a negative 120 dB. So that's how, if you really want your compression noticeable, you can do it. And of course, you have these ratios. They go from 1 to 1 all the way up to limit. Now, I want to talk about an interesting feature because a lot of people say that in the digital world of audio, if you go over a certain ratio of like maybe 10, some people will say 20, you start to hit definitely at 20, maybe the limiting world. That's not necessarily true. And if you want to be really anal about it, it isn't true in the sense that analog circuits of old limiters were different when they were a limiter versus a compressor. Like if you have a very high ratio on an analog compressor, like a physical box compressor and a rack mount, it's going to use a different circuit at a ratio of 20 than a limiter will use. So there is a hidden effect here. That's why I said there's actually more effects than 10. When you go to limit and you move the ratio all the way up, the effect is using a different emulated circuit. So that's a little fun bit of knowledge right there. Then of course you have attack, release, and gain. I'm not going to cover those because it's just generic compressor stuff. Let's talk about this multiband. What this is doing, to the best of my understanding, is it's going to let certain frequencies through. It's going to they're all going to be squashed pretty hard. So it's going to make your sound very bright. But because of the way that human ear perceives sound, we're going to notice the high frequencies a little bit more because we're used to not hearing those squashed as much. So it's kind of this like tug of war feature where the sounds are swelling in the middle. And this is a really cool thing that you can use in conjunction with the reverb. So let's put the reverb on. I don't know why I took the EQ. That was dumb. All right, so let's take the reverb, turn it on, and let's listen to the reverb right now without the compressor. Okay. And now let's listen to that same effect with the multiband compression on. And I'll take the multiband off, so now it's just a normal compressor. I'll turn the threshold up a little. So you see that to get that kind of really slappy, huge, upward expanding reverb signal that's popular in some genres of EDM, you can use those in tandem to do it. It's kind of like it's called upward compression, basically. So you can do that with reverb, but this multiband is basically an upwards compressor. So it's kind of like a second effect unit, or third effect unit rather, in the compressor, because you have that limiter circuit as well. So generally that multiband will slam very, very, very hard. So it'd be good only for be terrible for pads, be terrible for any ambient trance type sounds. It'd be really awesome for potentially your drops to get them really slappy and huge. All right, so now that we've covered the compressor, let me go back to the initial preset. So these are in the normal order because I move stuff around. Let's talk about the reverb. The reverb's pretty basic. I think it was made or licensed from Tal, T-A-L, the guy. I think it's one guy. He puts out some really cool free or very, very cheap plugins, so I believe it's from him. So it's a good sounding reverb. You have size, pre-delay, low cut, damp, which at verb damp 0, the signal rings out a little bit longer. So let me turn my signal back up. See, it rings out a lot longer. And then when it's up to 100, it's a much shorter signal, and that's dependent on the size as well. And then you have width, which is just going to spread out the width of your reverb. So let's play this. The reverb's in the center and kind of ugly. Now let's turn this up. It's out wider, and again you have a mix knob as well. Let's look at the EQ module now. This is going to be good for basic things that maybe you need to EQ something after an effect that made it to, like let's say you want to use a few effects in the effects rack, and let's say the distortion boosted too many high frequencies and you don't want to throw those on into the reverb or the delay. Well, then you would order it like distortion. You'd have your distortion, EQ, and then you'd have your reverb or delay because you could take out those certain frequencies. So that's really helpful, but it's a generic, rather basic EQ, but it gets the job done. So you have your frequency control over here, your Q, which is going to be the width of the frequencies that you're cutting out, and then your gain. So you have different shapes for curves. You have your low pass, high pass, all that stuff. And you can move the gain around as you need. So let's go back to this low, turn the frequency up. So you can cut out all your lows of the sound, boost it if you need to. And you have on the right-hand side, you have those same controls, but they are generally meant to control the higher end of the frequency spectrum. All right, let's go on to the filter. Now, even though this technically I wouldn't call it an effect, it's basically after the output stage of the oscillators and filter. So it happens after this oscillator tab occurs and heading to the output of Serum. So it's a great way to introduce using 2 filters in Serum, because Serum, you might have noticed, only has one. And you might think that's a limit or a liability, but it's really not, because you can load up multi-stage filters here. You can load up 3 filters onto one slot, so you can technically have 4, so that you can modulate between them. So there's a lot of features embedded in that idea. You have all of the same filter types in this filter in the effects rack that you do on the oscillator filter, so it's the same. You get cutoff, resonance, drive, fat, and mix. The cool thing is with a lot of these effects is you can modulate. So let me load up a LFO, and I can take this and I can modulate the mix of my filter, and I can use a crazy filter type, like let's use a format right now and see how this sounds. All right, so that's a really quick demo of how you can use your modulators on a lot of these different effects racks. You can take an envelope to control certain parts of the width of your reverb, really anything that you want. So that's really, really cool because that's why the reverbs, I mean, when you load up the effects, you still see your envelopes and your LFOs. It's so you can modulate them. And you can get some really cool effects doing that. So that sums up part 9 of this tutorial course. In the next section, we are going to be discussing the modulation matrix. I will see you there.